Hi, Angela Wolf here, fashion designer and vlogger, and what sew-along would not be complete without a few pattern hacks. So in this one, I want to show you how to change this neckline to add buttons and a buttonhole. Now this neckline, I kept the exact same but you have the buttons and the buttonhole, it can be closed, and then you'd add all your collar like we did earlier. So the big difference, if you compare your pattern, is that instead of that angle, like I was doing, you would just have a line straight up. And this is 1 inch. Top stitching, well, it's not top stitching, stay stitching. So then when I trim this, just like we did before, and then cut into each corner, go back over here and press this. So the big difference here is how you attach the placket at the bottom, how you measure your buttons and buttonhole. Otherwise, it's pretty close to what we did earlier. Give a little steam. All right. And I'm folding right along that stay stitching line. Again, this allows your stitching, when you add your placket, to be pretty straight. I'm never sure if it's perfectly straight, but it's pretty straight. And then just fold back that little bottom edge here. All right. Okay, so I have this ready to go. I also have my 2 plackets here folded in half, same as before. 2 of these that are cut just a little bit longer. Let's go to the machine. There's the raw edges. They match up to the raw edges here. I'm going to flip this around, line up those like this, and do a straight stitch. I'm just going to stitch right along the stay stitching line or the fold, whichever one is straighter, and go right to the edge of this triangle right here. Not through it, just to the edge. Get this. There you go. Now we're going to grab the other side. Again, doing the same thing that we did previously. Flip it to the wrong side. There's our raw edges. Again, I'm leaving plenty of room at each end because I'll trim that off. As I mentioned earlier, you don't have to do that. It just makes it easier, I think. Back stitch and stitch to the end. Now this is where the difference is from the last placket that we do. I'm going to go up here and mark my buttonhole and my buttons. Okay, and then to the right side. See how that lines up pretty good. So before you do your top stitching and you sew that bottom section like we did previously, this is where we're going to mark our buttonholes. So this is how, I always think of this with a top. It buttons like this for a woman. So this is the bottom where the buttons are going to go, and this is where the buttonholes are going to go. So I have this little contraption. What I'm going to do is mark where I want the bottom of the buttonhole, okay? So I want the bottom of the buttonhole this way coming up. And you want to make sure, what I'm doing is I'm marking where all 3 of these are, but I want to stay clear of this collar area. So I'm just going to make that a little bit smaller. It's showing me just how to make these even. If I could keep the fabric straight. Let's see here. Try that again. 1, 2, 3. Now keep this in the same position and lay it to the side, because when we're finished sewing these button holes, we're going to sew all this together, and then the last step will be sewing the buttons underneath. All right, now because this isn't sewn at the bottom, I've got this huge area to allow me to sew a buttonhole. I think that's much easier than having it all sewn together. So I'm lining up this chalk mark right here with this red line. If you can see that in the foot. So let me slide this over and then I'll move my hand out of the way. That's pretty close. Making sure that I'm lining the edge of my foot up with the edge of that stitching. Choose a buttonhole again, it doesn't matter what you pick. Now another idea on this placket, if you really want to get creative, you could make this longer, as long as you want to, if you have buttons on it. So it'd be the same process, you just would have to draw the lines longer and make longer plackets to put in here. This is a common collar on golf shirts, things like that. All right, one is done, finished. Let's move on to the next. I'm just sliding down, there's my chalk mark. The most important part is to make sure that that pressed edge is straight. Otherwise your buttonholes will all be crooked. Now I'm using a contrasting color thread so you can see it. So if you're using the same color thread and you make a little bit of a mistake, it's not going to be too noticeable because the button will be through that. So don't fret if it's not just right. All right. And one more. I'm sure you don't need to watch me sew 3 buttonholes, but there's a reason for this, because then when I line all this up with the buttons, you'll understand how I'm doing that. Actually, buttonholes are so much easier to sew nowadays. The machines and the special feet make it very easy. One thing I might not have mentioned is inside these plackets, there is interfacing here, and that is what will prevent your buttonholes from fraying. I don't know if you saw that earlier. This one I'm using black fusible knit. On the previous episode, I did white. So, all right, so our buttonholes are finished. Let's go back up here. Slide this. All right, it's looking pretty good. So the next step I want to do, because if I don't sew this bottom edge before I put the buttons on, it could end up a little bit crooked. So what I want to do is make sure this is nice and even. This lines up really nice. I'm just going to grab a pin. I usually have pins stuck in my shirt, but not today. I'm just going to pin that. So I've pinned through both of these layers. So I know that's where I'm going to stitch at the bottom. Now let's mark our buttonholes. Oops, you know what? I did that backwards. Here you go. Buttonhole goes on the top. There we go. That looks right. There. Now notice when I pull this, see how it can change? You want that to be a perpendicular area down here. That looks pretty straight. So I've pinned through both plackets and this layer here. See? I'm going to go back and mark my buttons. If you locate the center of your buttonholes, now it looks like one of mine might be a little bit off, but I'm just going to leave it for now. Mark where you want. This is just a fabric marking pen that will disappear in 24 hours. I'm just going to give myself 3 circles for my buttons. So the next steps are going to be to sew this bottom area like I did earlier. We're going to top stitch around here and attach our buttons. Hold this in place, flip it to the back side, and that's where I'm going to be stitching, right across here. Now, if you remember previously, I told you to stitch kind of on a curve right through here, and that's what we're going to do again. And I'm using white thread so you can see this, and then I'll stop so you You see how that's curved in just a little bit? So from corner to corner, and then that's curved. I'm gonna trim off the excess. Now, if you have a serger, now is when you would go through and serge this entire edge. I would suggest doing it with the fabric of the garment side up so you don't actually cut something that you don't want to cut. And I'm just going to attach one of the buttons here to show you how to do that again, and then we're pretty much finished. So here's my buttonhole foot. I'm going to just slide my button in place. Again, keeping my shank to the back if you have that on yours. Slide that into place. All right, go to your button stitch, which actually lowers your feed dogs and slides your button in place. I'm putting my button on where the stitching goes this way, and that will match how the buttonhole is. Do it by hand first to make sure your needle goes through the right holes. Stitch. Now you're going to attach all 3 buttons. I don't think you need to see me do those. When you're doing your top stitching, you need to be careful that you don't accidentally sew these 2 together. So I'm pushing it out of the way to start. Stitch all the way down. And then I stop. And I'm going to just lift this up, slide the bottom of the placket underneath. Now, this is when you would button them in place, by the way, if you had them. Go this down. Now you're stitching through both plackets and the garment. And then back up this side. Now I'm going to slide this out of the way again, just because it's easier to see. So I'm stitching just a scant away from this edge here, like 1/8 of an inch. If your buttons get in the way, you can always stop and move your needle to a different position. So let's go up here and see what we have. This is looking really good. So that's nice top stitching around. You'd have all of your buttons. And the last thing you'll need to do is cut these open. I showed you on a previous episode how to do this, but you can add a dab of fray check. And you just push this in place. This is much safer than a seam ripper or scissors, because if you go too far, you're gonna have to sew this whole part over. So there we go. And since I only have 1 button on there, I'll just cut one of these for you. And this is a variation where you can have a button collar for this tunic. Very easy to do. In the next episode, I'm going to show you how to hem the garment.